Hey, Pastor. Can the non-dividing issues between denominations slide down the slippery slope into greater issues? In other words, if Bible-believing churches don't try to correct even the minor issues of our fellow worshipers, couldn't the entire church lose its witness to the world or even slip into heresy?
That's a question that's got a lot of facets to it,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of directions that you could go in, and arguing yay or nay on those points. What I would say, the way I'd answer that, I think there are certain, what I guess what you'd call negotiables, where there would be very honest differences of opinion on interpretation of Scripture that does not have anything to do, with our salvation and that kind of thing. I mean, yes, we've got to argue for the tenets of what's required for someone to be born again.
Definitely.
We have to be diligent on those. We have to stay true to those, because that's literally spiritual life and death, and in the way that you present that to people.
Yeah.
So those are non-negotiables. But then there are negotiables that are, we interpret the Scripture this way, we interpret it another way, and there's arguing points,
Mm-hmm.
on those. And there are some of those that I think that, they're not, they're just not something big enough to be divided over, and for instance, there's this one is a sad one to me, because there is so much division when there should not be, over different translations of the Bible.
Yeah.
That is such a hot button issue with some people, and yet the truth is, primarily the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, along with maybe some. I think I learned in seminary. I like to say this word because it just sounds so big. But I don't even know what all it means. Ugaritic languages, and and I don't even know what that means. But primarily Hebrew, a little bit of Ugaritic, and a few others, and then the New Testament. The what you maybe just say Old Greek, Koine Greek, but so any Bible. Not every translation is good. There are some I would definitely not recommend.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also a number that I think really are good, that have interpreted from the copies that we have of the original text.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any of the original text, but of the copies that were made of the original text. And they've sought to be as accurate as they can into the English that we use today.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I appreciate that, because they're trying to get it as close as they can get it, and so for churches to completely divide and have bitter feuds over translations that are honestly not some of the wild-eyed ones, but some that really are seeking to be accurate. I just don't see there's no productivity in that argument.
Right.
Now let's go to the other side, though. Let's say, for instance, our church, myself being one of the pastors, one of the preaching pastors here, we do believe that the sign gifts that would be, miracles and healings and tongues, we believe that those ceased, in the age of the New Testament, and not that we don't believe that God no longer does miracles or healing, but not through the hand of a man like an apostle.
Mm-hmm.
We don't believe that, and we don't believe the gift of tongues is active today, because the reason for it has passed. The reason for it ceased. I mean, and we will make a pretty big deal about that, about that issue. And someone might say, well, what's the issue? Because we just simply interpret the Scripture differently. We think they are alive.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason is because of the abuses. We see so much abuse of those situations. It has become an issue where a lot of false teachers have used those not only to line their pockets financially, but to go into fake ministry that there's absolutely no medical, corroboration with what they're doing. They've had no medical professors to say, hey, we were in the service, we examined this person before we examined them afterward, and there's undoubtedly,
Right.
and it just becomes a way of cranking people's tractors, so to speak,
Definitely.
and getting people motivated on something that's not even true and genuine. And so because of that, and because we see it can cause people to slide into a place of, sow your vow of faith and you'll get your miracle. And folks fall into it, they begin to equate that with the gospel. Well, if I just give, a certain amount of money, or I give this or give that, then I'm going to get my miracle. And,
Right.
it's almost like they can buy something off of God.
It's more of an investment.
Yeah. I
than
mean,
anything.
how different is that than the old Catholic Church selling indulgences?
Yeah.
In years gone by, selling forgiveness,
Right.
So would we as a church speak very strongly to that issue? Yeah, because we've seen the tremendous abuses
Mm-hmm.
that have come with that. Another hot button issue that's very hot today, because of the recent Southern Baptist Convention, and one of the main overarching topics of their convention this year was whether or not they would stay in friendly cooperation with a church that had a woman pastor.
Okay.
And now there are those that I believe are genuine believers, who are truly born again. They truly believe the gospel, but they believe that women pastors that's okay. It's biblical. And there are those that are like us that do not believe so. And I think that we can argue it with Scripture quite adeptly. Matter of fact, because I was telling my wife, there's just such simplicity that we overlook.
Definitely.
One of the qualifications for a pastor is to be the husband of one wife. That's pretty simple.
Yeah.
That's not really. You don't have to do a whole lot of digging to figure that out. I mean, it just says what it says.
Mm-hmm.
That's the qualification. But yet there are so many other things as well. Would we argue that point? Yeah, we would. We would certainly come to the debate table with that one, for the reason, again, that we see abuses. And also, if the church is employing something that is not of Him, then can God bless that? Can God bless what is not of Him?
No.
Well, He's not going to bless what's not of
Right.
Him. And so, yeah, there are slippery slopes in those. If you ignore the Scripture on one thing, then what's to say you're not going to ignore it on something else?
Mm-hmm.
And there is a slippery slope. So I'm kind of answering it on both sides of my mouth, but I hope it makes sense. There are some minor issues that don't have a lot of consequence.
Yeah.
And those are ones that we can just kind of, okay, yeah, we disagree on that, but it doesn't break fellowship. It doesn't, it's not going to, if somebody wanted to come into our church, it wouldn't hinder them from being, a good, faithful member of our church. We could just agree to disagree. But then there are some like those that I mentioned, and certainly that's not the only ones, but just a few, that someone of that persuasion that believes that would probably have a difficult time in our church, because we very much do not believe those things.
Yeah.
And we believe that they can lead to abuses, and they can cause you to become accepting of things that we believe are not biblical, so yeah, some you just agree to disagree, but there are some I think they're hills to die on.
So do you think it's just a case by case basis then? Like, depends on what the issue is.
I would. You and I were talking before we started the podcast that two of my favorites that have both gone to be with the Lord recently were John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul.
Mm-hmm.
And those two guys were very, very dear friends. They preached together. They did theological studies together. They played golf together. I mean, these guys were great guys and great buddies. But they had very different views on infant baptism.
Mm-hmm.
And Sproul was a Presbyterian background, and he believed in basically baby baptism, as a picture of the covenant, that God has made, and then MacArthur, though he was very reformed in his theology, he would probably hold almost to more of a Baptistic row, a person's got to come to know Jesus, and baptism is a picture of salvation. So what really is the benefit of a baptism for a baby when it's a picture of salvation? That baby's not been saved yet, and so, so they had a very running disagreement on that, and they would laugh about it and they would debate about it, and they, but they always came out friends, and it did not prevent them from fellowshipping together, and they were both very effective with the gospel, so those are, case by case basis, those kind of things, they were able to continue fellowship, and it didn't interrupt anything, because it did not lead to a slippery slope into something that could be really troublesome to the church or Christians.
Right.
Whereas there are other things, that very much could become a slippery slope and troubled issues. So yeah, I agree. I think you would just have to take that on a case by case basis.
Okay. Yeah. So possible. Sure. It just depends on what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us for another episode of Hey Pastor. If you have a question about the Bible, theology, or even day-to-day Christianity, email it to us at podcast@fellowshipchapel.us. Again, that's podcast@fellowshipchapel.us. Your question may be on a future episode. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you again next week, and remember that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life.